Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Alex Sigrist, and today we're going to talk about a documentary that I just finished watching. I got it today, and I finished it today, called Totally Under Control, which is a documentary about the U.S.'s handling of the coronavirus. If you've been following this channel, you know that I like to follow the U.S. handling of the coronavirus. And I've been relatively critical, so I was expecting pretty much just that in this film. And with this documentary, I thought maybe I'd learn a little bit more and be able to share a little bit with you because it's not a free documentary. I ended up buying it on Amazon, renting it on Amazon for 48 hours for, I think, $4.99. And just to give you the background of it a little bit, it is a documentary by a couple of filmmakers, Alex Gibney, who you might know from Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, Client 9, The Rise and Fall of Elliot Spitzer, and a few other different documentaries. Also, Ophelia Harut Union and Suzanne Hillinger also did this documentary. They worked together, and they basically filmed a documentary on the start of the pandemic up till around April of the pandemic. Now, they've added little tidbits of information after that because it was just released, and of course, as you know, it's now October and not April. So they've kind of shoved a whole bunch of stuff into the end of it, but most of it was kind of the initial handling of the pandemic. So to talk about, I guess, what was good and bad about this particular one, I guess I'll kind of talk about my notes because I did write down some notes as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about in this video about it. But I think as I go through the notes, it'll start to make sense of how I felt on this. If you're looking for a quick answer, yes, I think it's worth seeing, but I think you should probably watch it with a couple of people, split the $5, get yourself a bag of popcorn or glass of wine to wash down the ridiculousness that is the American response to the coronavirus. But Totally Under Control starts off with January 2nd, talking about the first case in Seattle, with the first case in Seoul, the first official coronavirus patients, or at least positive cases, of the United States and South Korea. And one of the early lines that really got to me, which is kind of obvious, though, once you think about it, is that politics got in the way of science, and that's sort of what it's all about. Now, if you don't know, this title, too, Totally Under Control, comes from, I believe it was a January quote where Donald Trump said, we've got this thing totally under control. And, you know, clearly, as we find out, as we already know, it's not. I'll talk a little bit more about the situation in the U.S. now after this, but let's keep going a little bit. The big deal was that Donald Trump was trying to get back into the White House for a second term, is still trying at the filming of this video, and the economy was sort of what was going to propel him into the White House, and that's why politics got in the way of science this time around. Now, it was interesting how they did the interviews. I wonder if I can even show a video or like a post of this at all, but they actually had the people sit down in their houses, it seemed like, and they set up this I don't even know, it's like a bunch of plastic sheets around the camera and lighting to keep the filmmakers away from the actual people being interviewed. So they followed all the protocols that were necessary to go ahead and get the footage of the people interviewed. The people that we see interviewed are usually the scientists and I think there's a couple of reporters in there as well. There's one from Seoul. There's one from the Seoul Beat anyway. I believe there's someone from Hong Kong and a few scientists working in the labs, but also a few scientists working for the CDC and volunteers working for the CDC. The CDC officially did not, well, I guess they didn't officially. They never responded to be in the video, so they are not in the video. So technically it's one-sided, but there's an obvious reason why they don't want to be in the video. So anyway, it goes through, it talks about how it started in China, and it talked about Crimson Contagion, which was a particular pandemic drill that they did every fall, and how they knew how to do it. One of the other themes of the movie is like all of the scientists knew what to do in the situation. They knew the plans, the protocols, and even the politicians knew what they were supposed to do because they did say that throughout in all the interviews that they were in. But they talked about this, except now the problem is you got the head of the CDC being someone who was a pharmaceutical executive who was more worried about the free market taking care of the virus. We have talks about, and then we get into sort of the Korea-U.S. differences, One of them being that diagnostic tests were approved almost immediately in South Korea. They were sort of pre-approved in that they told them to start making them, and they would go through the approval process after they were out in the field getting used. I think that was one of the other things. So many themes in this movie, so many things you can pick from. So another one was how Korea was just ahead of the game and just trying everything, but also getting things out there, getting rid of bureaucratic red tape, and, literally then letting the free market do its thing. But it wasn't necessarily a free market. It was the government saying, here's the direction you want to go. But they cut out a lot of that red tape that people do complain about. They focused on the testing failures of the CDC, of the inability for the Trump administration to then get past those failures, because there's a particular reason that you see in the documentary as to why the original test didn't work. And they just had to cut out one of the steps, and that would have made it work, but they couldn't get through the legal, red tape there. They just followed basically what the CDC did and did not do, what the Trump administration did and did not do. Also pointing out some interesting facts, like remdesivir, which now we found out isn't really effective. It was $10 to make each dose, and Gilead, I found out, charged $3,000 a patient, and this was allowed by the Trump administration. So, yeah, there was a lot that came out of this documentary that I didn't know, but I think let's go ahead and talk about it now. That was sort of my quick summary of the things that I found out and what happened and what I wrote down. Let's talk about it just a little bit. I don't think you're going to find a lot of new information in this documentary if you've been following it closely, if you've been looking at what's been happening, because we sort of know the steps that the Trump administration didn't take. And if you've been watching the situation in South Korea and China and the United States, and you've been seeing the differences, that's sort of what was talked about in the documentary. The difference now is that you actually can see the scientists, and they're in a proper filming setting now. And it's not just a hearing in front of the U.S. Congress with different politicians bickering and asking pointed questions that aren't necessarily important. This whole start, what is this fly killer doing in here? And I think it was nice to see that the scientists actually got their voices heard. Because, again, another theme was that whenever scientists spoke up in the Trump administration, they were fired or at least put behind the scenes right after that. So it was good to see them say these things, and you found out some interesting things like the costs of producing remdesivir, and you do learn a little bit. And I think that was a good part of the movie, is it added more context and added some facts that you could have to, if you're going to argue with someone, you could bring to the table and say, hey, these are the things that happened. This is the timeline. This is why what the U.S. did was wrong, and here's how we can improve for the next time. But I think also, like, the biggest realization I had, I knew it, we all know this in a way, came when the South Korea correspondent for one of the news agencies said something to the extent of, South Koreans no longer look to the U.S. as the model country of how to be. And I think if you take all the themes within the documentary and put it all together, that's kind of the one overall theme that stayed with me to the end. And I think that's sort of, it's just interesting to hear someone else say it and put it in such good words, and to kind of realize, like, maybe this is what the film was all about, is that the U.S. just was not the model of a country to be during this pandemic. They were not the ones doing the right things. They were failing left and right. They were not acting when they should have. I think it was almost just a depressing documentary that needed to be made in order just to remind people of all the things that would happen. That's one thing I noticed about it too. I was always saying, oh yeah, I remember that. Oh yeah, I remember that. For like all these different things, like the states fighting for different PPE, like states fighting each other, trying to get personal protective equipment, but they were bidding against each other. And then FEMA joined in the bidding war, causing the costs of these products to skyrocket, making it harder for states to get the PPE for their health professionals. Remember when the CDC recommended that we don't wear masks? That was kind of crazy too. And I just kept saying, yeah, remember when? I remember that. And it just reminded me of all the crazy things that have happened in the last 10 months, basically, since the virus came to the U.S. It's wild. I do have a criticism of the film. I think that the ending itself felt rushed in that, I think they stopped filming really in April, but they kind of tried to add all this information at the end. Well, here's what happened in May and what happened in June. And if you forget, don't forget a lot of the protests that were happening in the U.S., which are a part of the conversation, didn't even happen until May in many cases, in end of May and June, July-ish, right? So they put some stuff in the end to try and bring a point, but really what the actual documentary felt like, it was more like part one of a 3-part epic series on the virus. Because, we had a whole summer and a half to go through at that point, it felt like. And then we're also experiencing our second wave, third wave, fifth wave, I don't know what wave we're on now, where the U.S. recently hit 70,000 cases a day again. And they're hitting, I think the last 5 days, the numbers have been above 50,000. So we're up on that second wave again. So much has happened that it just was... It's like I knew the ending of part 2 before part 1 came out, right? Because like I said, that's why there's a fly there. That's why I got... I think... Yeah, the ending was less than satisfactory, but I think it was definitely worth a watch if you are someone who's been following closely or want to know more about what's been happening and have an honest conversation about it with yourself. The first thing that some of my friends say who I guess are pro-Trump supporters is always like, but what about the protests? What about the protests? And this documentary makes it very clear that the mistakes that were made in the U.S. were mistakes that were made in the beginning by the administration. And I think that's something we forget. We had all these conversations, but are the protests the reasons that it's spreading? Is it people going to the beach and swimming? And in the end, it was a bunch of failures at the top. A bunch of mistakes, being too late to suggest wearing masks, being too late to get masks out to people, not having enough masks in the National Reserve stockpile. The failure of the United States all happened in the beginning, and that's kind of what you get out of this movie. You get a lot out of this movie. I keep saying, this is the theme, this is the theme. You get so much out of this documentary. It's totally worth watching. It's called Totally Under Control by Alex Gibney, and I think if you're willing to spend a couple of bucks on a documentary, this would be a one to watch if you're interested in it. I don't know. I guess I'm supposed to give a star rating. It was a 4 out of 5. It was pretty good. It ended abruptly. I was kind of bummed about that, but I don't know if there's any other way you can end it. I think there needs to be I bet there will be a part 2 and a part 3 coming out. So that's what I'll be looking forward to. Hopefully the U.S. gets this under control. I'll talk more about it maybe in a video later this week, but for now, that's it. That's my review of Totally Under Control. Hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see more content from me, don't forget, like, subscribe, all that other stuff. And I will see you next time. Goodbye. Haseo.